A photograph from 1902, depicting innocent children, hides a chilling secret that remained untouched for over a century. But what if it was more than just a picture? What if something terrifying was lurking beneath the surface? In the quiet town of Westbrook, a seemingly innocent photograph surfaced after 118 years, revealing a group of children standing solemnly on the steps of an orphanage. The black and white image, faded with time, seemed like nothing more than a simple relic of a forgotten past. But as the years had passed, something had changed. One face, once lost to time, now seemed to beckon from the shadows. A girl with an unsettling smile. It was late October when Emma Blackwood, a 32-year-old archivist at the Westbrook Historical Society, first laid eyes on the photograph. As she carefully examined it, a shiver ran down her spine. The children's faces were grim, their eyes hollow with fear. But there was one, standing in the back row, who didn't look afraid. Instead, she smiled, almost as if she knew something the others didn't. Grave of the Shadows invites you to join Emma as she uncovers the terrifying truth behind this seemingly innocent photograph. With every turn, the secrets of the orphanage and its long-forgotten tragedy come to light, revealing a dark history that has waited patiently for the right person to uncover it. But what happens when the past refuses to stay buried? And what if that photograph holds more than just memories? It holds a warning. Don't forget to subscribe to Grave of the Shadows and hit the notification bell to explore more eerie mysteries that will leave you questioning the boundaries between the living and the dead. In the dimly lit basement of the Westbrook Historical Society, Emma Blackwood carefully opened a weathered cardboard box, her gloved hands handling the contents with the utmost care. The box had been donated by the estate of Margaret Thornton, the last living descendant of one of Westbrook's founding families. It contained a collection of journals, letters, and photographs, an archive of a time long past. Yet, among these relics, one item stood out. At the very bottom of the box, she found a large manila envelope, its edges worn but its contents surprisingly intact. As she pulled it free from the box, the smell of old paper filled the air. With a mixture of curiosity and caution, Emma slid the envelope open. Inside, she found a sepia-toned photograph, remarkably well-preserved despite the years of neglect. The photo was of an imposing Victorian building, its windows dark, as though even the structure itself had been left to watch over something tragic. The children in the photograph stood in neat rows, their faces solemn and their clothing matching. Identical gray uniforms, each one a small figure trapped in a moment frozen in time. Behind them, there were 4 adults, 3 women dressed in high-neck dresses, and 1 tall man in a dark suit with a clerical collar. The photograph was clearly taken in 1902, with the words Thornton Home for Children written in faded ink on the back, followed by the words Last Photograph Before the Tragedy in blue pen, written in a hand that Emma did not recognize. Her heart raced. She had lived in Westbrook her entire life, yet she had never heard of any tragedy connected to the orphanage. What had happened to those children? Why did this photo seem so haunting? As Emma scanned the photograph more closely, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The children's faces, though serious, appeared almost fearful. But there was one child, a girl in the back row, who didn't share the same somber expression. She was smiling, a small, unsettling smile that seemed far too out of place. Emma's curiosity grew as she carefully placed the photograph on her desk, her mind racing with questions. What tragedy was referenced on the back of the photo? Why had this orphanage, the Thornton Home for Children, been marked by such a cryptic note? She ran her fingers lightly over the surface of the image, her eyes lingering on the children's faces. They all seemed so still, almost too still, except for one. The girl in the back row, second from the right, stood out like a beacon. While the others appeared solemn, afraid even, this girl wore a small, barely perceptible smile. Emma stared at her for a moment, her pulse quickening. The smile wasn't one of happiness or joy. It was knowing, eerie, as though she held a secret, a dark one. Something about that smile felt out of place, even for a photo taken in 1902, when long exposure times often left faces with a serious or somber expression. Emma reached for her laptop, determined to find answers. As she typed the name Thornton Home for Children into the digital archives, she could feel a cold chill sweeping through the basement. The air seemed to thicken around her as if the very room was closing in. She ignored the unsettling feeling, focusing instead on the search results. Her eyes skimmed over articles, letters, and historical accounts about the orphanage. But one article caught her attention immediately. The headline read, "Tragedy Strikes Thornton Home. Fire Claims Lives of 27. Her heart skipped a beat. Could this photograph have been taken just days before the fire? The thought sent a cold shiver down her spine. She studied the photograph again, and this time her eyes locked on the girl with the smile. Was she somehow connected to the tragedy? Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were much closer than she realized. Emma continued her research, poring over archived articles and documents about the Thornton Home for Children. The fire that had ravaged the orphanage in 1902 seemed to be the central point of every record. Yet, despite the vast amount of information, there was still very little about the children in the photograph. The more she searched, the more she became obsessed with the eerie smile of the girl. Rose Collins, she had come to learn, was her name. Rose was one of the 3 children who had survived the fire, according to the articles she had read. But Emma couldn't reconcile the smile she had seen in the photo with the idea that Rose had been one of the survivors. The other 2 survivors, William Cooper and Mary Sullivan, were mentioned in the articles, their fates easily traced, but Rose's seemed to vanish after the fire. Emma's fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitant. What if the photograph was more than just an innocent snapshot? What if it had been taken just days before the fire, like the article implied? And if Rose had somehow survived, why had she been smiling? She leaned back in her chair, staring at the photograph on her desk. The more she thought about it, the more uneasy she became. Something was not right with this image. Why did the children appear so afraid? Was it just a reflection of the time? Was it simply the norm for children to look so grim in photographs taken during that era? Or was it something deeper? As she returned to the article detailing the fire, Emma found herself drawn to the details of the blaze. It had begun in the middle of the night, quickly engulfing the wooden structure. The survivors had been in a small infirmary, separate from the main building, but most of the children and caretakers had perished, overcome by smoke inhalation. The fire's cause was still listed as a faulty coal furnace, but Emma noticed something unsettling in one of the older reports. There was a mention of possible foul play, something the official records seemed to dismiss too quickly. Foul play? She murmured to herself, rereading the line. Could someone have deliberately started the fire? As she scrolled through more articles, Emma came across a report from a county welfare inspector who had visited the orphanage just a few months before the fire. It was a routine inspection, yet one particular comment stood out. The inspector had written about Rose's behavior, which had been troubling. The Collins girl is a disturbance among the other children. She has been speaking to herself in a manner that suggests she believes she is not alone. On the day of my visit, she stood staring at the building with an expression I can only describe as malevolent. When questioned, she said only, "They're all going to burn." Emma's eyes widened as she read the words. "They're all going to burn." It was an odd statement for a child to make, especially one who had been so young. Could Rose have somehow known what would happen? Or worse, had she caused it? She quickly opened a second tab on her computer and searched for any more information on Rose Collins. To her surprise, Emma found another article, this one from just after the fire. It detailed the tragic loss of life, naming the 3 children who had survived. The article also mentioned the state of the orphanage after the fire, describing it as a charred ruin, with only the stone foundation and parts of the chimney still standing. The part that caught Emma's eye, however, was a line buried near the end. 3 survivors remain: William Cooper, Mary Sullivan, and Rose Collins. Rose was treated for smoke inhalation, but no further mention of her fate is recorded in the follow-up reports. No further mention? That was odd. Emma had found records of the other survivors being placed with new families, but not Rose. Where had she gone? Had she vanished after the fire? Or was there something more sinister at play? As she continued to dig, Emma's sense of unease grew. The deeper she went, the more she felt as though she was unearthing something that was meant to remain buried. The photograph on her desk, which had once seemed like just a relic of a bygone era, was now the center of something far darker. At that moment, Emma's computer screen flickered. She blinked, thinking it was just the poor lighting in the basement, but when she looked at the image of the children again, something had changed. The smile on Rose's face, once subtle and unsettling, had grown wider. It wasn't just a smile anymore. It was a grin, one that stretched unnaturally across her face, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too exaggerated for a child. Emma recoiled in horror. Was this just her imagination, or had the photograph truly changed? The temperature in the basement seemed to drop, and Emma felt a shiver run through her. She quickly grabbed the photograph and examined it closely, but nothing about the image seemed to have changed physically. It looked the same, yet her gut told her something was wrong. Was it possible that the photograph had somehow changed in a supernatural way? A loud bang echoed from somewhere in the building, causing Emma to jump in her seat. The basement was silent, save for the occasional hum of the dehumidifier. But there it was again, a loud thud, followed by the sound of something or someone scraping across the floor. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she stood up and turned toward the source of the noise. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw a shadow move in the far corner of the room. Emma's hands trembled as she carefully returned the photograph to its envelope, placing it gently on the desk. The photograph, despite the unsettling changes she had witnessed, still felt like a relic of the past, a reminder of a time long gone. But it was more than that. It was a piece of the mystery she was slowly piecing together. A mystery that seemed to lead back to the orphanage fire of 1902. As she sat back down at her desk, Emma's mind raced. The more she read, the more she discovered that the fire was not just a tragic accident. It was the event that had torn apart the very fabric of the town's history. The orphanage, once a place of refuge for abandoned children, had been reduced to a smoldering ruin. The fire had spread so rapidly that by the time help arrived, there was nothing left but the charred remains of the building. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the fire wasn't just a random tragedy. It was a calculated, inevitable event. The records didn't suggest arson outright, but they hinted at it. Emma's eyes flicked back to the article detailing the aftermath of the fire. The official cause of the fire had been attributed to a faulty coal furnace. But something about the speed with which the fire had consumed the orphanage didn't sit right with her. As she read further, Emma discovered something even more disturbing. A report from a local fire inspector, written just days after the fire had destroyed the orphanage. The inspector had noted that the fire seemed to spread unusually fast, almost as though the building had been intentionally set ablaze. However, the idea of arson had been quickly dismissed. Why? Was there something more to this tragedy than Emma was being told? She closed the article and picked up the journals that had come with the donation. They belonged to Thomas Thornton, one of the founders of the orphanage. Thomas had poured his heart and soul into the home, but the journals reflected something darker. A man losing his grip on his sanity after the loss of his only child to scarlet fever. The entries were filled with a sense of grief and despair, but also a quiet determination to continue running the orphanage in honor of his lost son. But as Emma flipped through the pages, one journal entry stood out. It was dated November 5, 1902, just a few days before the fire. The handwriting was shaky, as though Thomas had written it in a rush. It read, "The building feels strange today. There is an unease in the air, something I cannot shake. The children are restless, and Rose Collins has been behaving even more erratically than usual. I fear for what will happen. I have spoken to Ella Laner about it, but she insists that Rose is just a troubled child. Still, I can't ignore the feeling that something terrible is about to happen. I will speak to the others about the need for stricter supervision, but I fear it may already be too late." Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she read those words. Rose Collins. It was clear from the entry that Thomas Thornton had been growing increasingly concerned about her behavior in the days leading up to the fire. But what had Rose done? Was it possible that she had been involved in starting the fire? The question gnawed at Emma's mind. She scanned the next few pages of the journal, but there were no further mentions of Rose. Emma opened the next box of records, hoping to find something that would answer her growing list of questions. As she sifted through the papers, one item caught her eye. A letter, dated November 12, 1902, just days after the fire had claimed so many lives. It was addressed to a colleague in Boston and was signed by Thomas Thornton. The letter was brief, but it was enough to send a chill down Emma's spine. I cannot bear to speak of it. The fire, it has claimed everything. My home, my staff, my children. I have lost so much. Only 3 children remain. I can only imagine what could have been. But I fear there is a darker truth that I dare not speak of. I fear that one of the children may have caused it, though I cannot prove it. Rose Collins. She was always different. Perhaps it was her. If I had only paid closer attention. I have failed them all. Emma dropped the letter back into the box and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Could it be? Had Rose been responsible for the fire that killed so many? The letter's cryptic tone seemed to suggest it. But why? What had driven Rose to such extremes? She continued her search, flipping through more articles and reports. Finally, she came across a photograph, one she had not seen before. It was of the orphanage after the fire, a blackened shell of a building, with only the stone foundation and chimney standing. The ruin was haunting, but what truly caught Emma's attention was the small group of survivors standing in front of the wreckage. William Cooper and Mary Sullivan were easily identifiable. But it was Rose Collins who caught Emma's eye once again. Unlike the others who stood solemn and quiet, Rose was standing slightly apart from the group, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on something beyond the camera. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a sense of coldness in her gaze. The smile that Emma had seen in the photograph was now replaced with something far more unsettling. Was this the same girl who had stood with the other children in the 1902 photograph? The one who had smiled so eerily, as though she knew something they didn't? Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. Something darker, something that had been hidden for over a century. As she looked at Rose's face in the photograph, Emma felt a deep sense of unease. The answers she sought were just beyond her reach. But they were getting closer, and she couldn't stop now. As Emma stared at the photograph of the orphanage ruins, her mind kept returning to Rose Collins. She was the one child who stood out, both in the photograph of the children and in the aftermath of the fire. The more Emma researched, the more she became fixated on Rose's story. The unsettling smile in the photo, the cryptic comments about fire and destruction, and the lack of clear answers in the historical records. Everything seemed to point back to Rose. Who was she really? Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Rose was at the center of it all. The more she read about Rose's behavior, the more convinced she became that the girl wasn't just another orphan who had suffered at the hands of tragedy. There was something deeper, something that hadn't been fully explored. Rose had always been different, even among the other children. The orphanage records mention her often, but not in a way that would suggest she was a typical child. She was described as troubled, peculiar, even possessed. The staff had been concerned with her erratic behavior, her tendency to speak to herself, and her disjointed, almost incoherent ramblings. Emma read a particularly chilling entry from one of the caretakers, written just weeks before the fire. Rose has been speaking to someone who isn't there. She says the voices tell her things she should never know. I fear for her. The other children are afraid of her. She stands in the yard, staring at the orphanage as if she can see something that none of us can. Yesterday, she said something that chilled me to the bone. They're all going to burn. Those words sent a cold shiver through Emma's body. They're all going to burn. Had Rose known what was about to happen? Or had she somehow caused it? Emma continued her search, hoping to find more clues about Rose. She eventually came across a rare personal account from Mrs. Ella Thornton, the wife of Thomas Thornton and the matron of the orphanage. The entry, dated September 3, 1901, detailed Rose's behavior in a way that seemed to confirm the growing concerns of the staff. Rose continues to be a source of concern. The other children avoid her, and Mrs. Blackwood reports that strange occurrences seem to follow the child. I have observed her speaking to herself when she believes no one is watching, carrying on conversations as if with an invisible companion. Thomas suggests we consult Dr. Richardson about the possibility of transferring her to the state hospital, but I cannot bear the thought of sending a child to such a place. I fear, however, that we are running out of options. The journal entry was a disturbing glimpse into Rose's life. It seemed that no one truly understood her or the depth of her troubles. Mrs. Thornton's decision not to send Rose to the hospital, despite the growing concerns, painted a picture of a woman who was in denial about the severity of the child's condition. Had her refusal to act led to the disaster that followed? Emma sat back in her chair, the weight of the discovery settling in. Rose Collins had been a source of fear and fascination for those around her. But why? What had caused her to behave the way she did? Was she truly troubled? Or was there something more at play? Something supernatural? As Emma continued to sift through the archives, she found more and more references to Rose, but they all seemed to raise more questions than answers. She discovered an old welfare report, filed by a county inspector who had visited the orphanage shortly before the fire. The report, too, contained troubling observations about Rose. The institution is generally well run, though I have concerns about the child, Rose Collins. She appears to be a disturbing influence on the other children. During my visit, I witnessed her standing alone in the yard, staring at the building with an expression I can only describe as malevolent. When questioned about her behavior, she replied only that, "They're all going to burn." Mrs. Thornton assures me the child has a vivid imagination and means no harm, but I recommend closer supervision. The idea that Rose's behavior was described as malevolent struck Emma as particularly chilling. The more she learned about Rose, the more she felt as if she were unraveling a thread that led directly to the fire. Could Rose have somehow known what would happen? Or, more disturbingly, had she been involved in starting the fire herself? Emma's mind raced with the implications. Was Rose a victim of her circumstances, an innocent child manipulated by forces beyond her control? Or had she been something more? A troubled soul consumed by anger and fear, leading to a catastrophic event that claimed the lives of 27 people? The more Emma dug into Rose's past, the more she realized that there were no easy answers. Rose had been a complex, enigmatic figure, one who defied explanation. And the truth, it seemed, was buried beneath layers of fear, misunderstanding, and perhaps even guilt. But one thing was clear: Rose's story was far from over, and Emma was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how dark or twisted it might be. As Emma dove deeper into her research, the air around her seemed to grow heavier. The once quiet basement of the Westbrook Historical Society had become a place of unease, where each creak of the floorboards or flicker of the lights only heightened her growing anxiety. Her discoveries had unearthed more than just historical facts. They had awakened something ancient and malevolent. It started with the photograph. At first, Emma had chalked it up to an optical illusion or perhaps a trick of the light. But as the days passed, the unsettling changes in the image became impossible to ignore. One morning, as she opened the digital scan of the 1902 photograph, she was struck by the most disturbing alteration yet. Rose's smile, once subtle and cryptic, had turned into a wide, chilling grin. The eyes of the children surrounding her appeared hollow, like ghostly reflections, their faces blurred in a way that made Emma's stomach turn. Emma leaned in closer to the screen, her breath shallow. The digital image had shifted in ways that defied logic. She zoomed in on Rose's face, and it was as though the girl was staring directly at her, the intensity of the gaze unnerving. The smile didn't seem friendly. It seemed knowing, predatory even, as if Rose were silently whispering her terrible secret to Emma. Her pulse quickened. What was happening? How was the photograph changing like this? Determined to get to the bottom of it, Emma decided to scan the original photograph again, thinking that perhaps the issue was with the digital file. She placed the photo on the scanner, ensuring everything was aligned correctly. When the scan appeared on her screen, she couldn't believe her eyes. The image was unchanged from the previous scan. The same eerie smile, the same hollow eyes, the same chilling atmosphere that had now permeated every moment of her waking hours. A sense of dread gripped her. The photograph had become more than just a memory of a long-forgotten tragedy. It had become a portal, an entryway into something far darker than she could have ever imagined. Her hands shaking, Emma returned the photograph to its envelope and placed it back on the shelf. She tried to calm her racing thoughts. "It's just a photograph," she told herself. "This is all in your head." But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Something about this photograph had brought the past to life, and whatever force was connected to it wasn't done with her yet. That evening, as Emma sat in the basement, poring over more records and trying to make sense of the strange phenomena, she felt a sudden coldness sweep through the room. The temperature had dropped sharply, and her breath became visible, the air now thick with frost. She glanced around, but the basement was silent, save for the hum of the dehumidifier. She checked the thermostat, 68 degrees, the same as it had been all day. The temperature shouldn't have dropped like that. Uneasy, she stood up, wrapping her arms around herself for warmth. That's when she heard it. The sound of footsteps, light and quick, echoing from the far corner of the room. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Who else could be down here? She was the only one working late, the building having long since closed for the evening. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. "Hello," Emma called out, her voice trembling slightly. There was no answer, only the soft scrape of footsteps across the concrete floor. With a sense of rising panic, Emma grabbed the nearest flashlight and shone it toward the source of the sound. Her breath hitched in her throat when the beam landed on the far corner of the basement, where shadows seemed to shift unnaturally. A small, ghostly figure stood there, half hidden in the darkness. It was a child, dressed in a faded gray uniform. Emma's legs went weak. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring at her with eyes that seemed far too ancient for such a small face. "Who are you?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. It simply smiled, that same eerie, knowing smile she had seen in the photograph. Emma stumbled back, bumping into a stack of crates. The figure remained where it was, as still as the shadows it seemed to emerge from. She turned and fled up the stairs, not daring to look back until she reached the safety of her car parked outside the building. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she sat behind the wheel. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She couldn't go back to the Historical Society tonight. Not after what she had seen. The child in the uniform, the smile, and the photograph. She couldn't forget the photograph. As she drove away, Emma's mind raced with questions. What had she witnessed? Was it real? Or had she finally lost her mind, consumed by the dark history she had unearthed? Whatever the answer, she knew one thing for certain. Rose Collins had found her, and Rose wasn't going to let her go. The following day, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every corner of her apartment felt colder than usual, and no matter how much she tried to distract herself, her mind kept returning to the basement and the eerie presence she had felt there. The figure she had seen, the child in the gray uniform, kept haunting her thoughts. Had it been real, or had she imagined it in her fear and exhaustion? It didn't matter. What mattered now was the sense of urgency she felt. The haunting, the photograph, the disturbing smile. Everything was connected to Rose Collins, and Emma had to confront it head-on. That evening, after hours of deliberating, Emma returned to the Historical Society. Her footsteps echoed in the empty building as she made her way to the basement. The eerie quiet of the place unsettled her, but she steeled herself for what was to come. She couldn't let this mystery, this dark presence, control her any longer. As she descended the stairs, she was immediately hit with the same bone-chilling cold that had plagued her the night before. The basement felt alive, as if the air itself was vibrating with energy. Emma took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She knew that if she wanted answers, she had to face what lay in this room. She turned the corner and found the photograph sitting exactly where she had left it. It was now completely still, resting on the desk in its envelope. But something was different. The room felt heavier, as though the shadows themselves had thickened, pressing in on her from all sides. Emma reached out to touch the photograph again, her fingers trembling as they brushed the surface. The smile on Rose's face had changed once more. This time, it wasn't just unsettling. It was sinister. The grin stretched unnaturally wide, like a twisted mask of joy, but the eyes, those eyes, remained locked on Emma, filled with a chilling knowing. "Rose," Emma whispered, her voice barely a breath. "What do you want from me?" Suddenly, the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening into an inky blackness that crept along the walls. Emma's heart raced as she spun around, searching for the source of the change. Then, she heard it, soft, childlike laughter echoing through the basement. It wasn't a joyous sound. It was a mocking, eerie giggle that filled the empty space. The sound of footsteps, too, began to echo through the room. Emma's eyes widened as the shadows at the far end of the basement began to move. A figure emerged from the dark. A small child, dressed in a tattered gray uniform, her face pale and gaunt, her hair falling in disarray around her shoulders. It was Rose Collins. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the ghostly figure slowly approached. Rose's eyes, dark and hollow, glowed with an amber light, like embers from a dying fire. Her lips parted into that same chilling smile, and Emma felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "You're the one who found me," Rose's voice echoed, soft and distant, but unmistakably real. The air around Emma seemed to freeze, and the temperature dropped even further. "You woke me up, Emma Blackwood. I've been waiting for someone to finally see me." Emma took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Why? What do you want from me?" She tried to remain steady, but the presence of Rose, so cold and terrifying, made her feel as if the very foundation of the building was crumbling beneath her feet. Rose's smile widened, and she raised a finger, pointing toward the photograph on the desk. "Do you see now, Emma? Do you see what I've been hiding?" Her voice trembled with something ancient and angry, as if the weight of years of suffering had finally been released. "I was just a child, but they turned me into something else, something monstrous. I was punished for things I never did, for being different." Emma's voice was hoarse as she spoke, her body trembling. "I'm sorry, Rose. I didn't know. I didn't understand. But I see it now. I see what they did to you." Rose tilted her head, as if considering Emma's words. "You couldn't have understood, but you do now. You found the truth. That's why I'm here, to make you see." Emma swallowed, her thoughts racing. What could she do? What could possibly stop this? Rose wasn't just a memory, a photograph. She was real. Her presence was undeniable, her rage palpable in the cold air. She had come to claim justice, not just for herself, but for all the children who had suffered because of the Thornton family's cruelty. "I'm sorry for what happened to you," Emma whispered, taking another step forward. "But I need to know what happened to the fire. Was it you? Did you start it?" Rose's face twisted into a sorrowful grimace, her eyes glimmering with tears, but they didn't fall. "I didn't want to burn them all, Emma, but they pushed me. They made me into something I wasn't. They told me I was evil. They locked me away in the cellar, punished me for being different. And then they tried to send me away. They thought they could fix me, but I couldn't take it anymore. When the fire started, I was already trapped. They had left me behind." The room seemed to darken further, and Emma could feel the cold wrapping around her, suffocating her. She was frozen in place, unable to move. Rose's figure loomed closer, and Emma could hear her breath, cold and rasping. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't mean for them all to die," Rose continued, her voice soft, almost apologetic. "But I wanted to make them feel what they had done to me. And now, I want them to know. You will know. And I will finally rest." The ground beneath Emma's feet seemed to tremble, and with one final, intense look, Rose vanished into the shadows, her laughter echoing as she disappeared. Emma stood alone in the darkness, her heart racing. The presence was gone, but the weight of what she had learned, of the truth that had come to light, settled heavily on her. Rose's spirit had not come to torment her. It had come to make her see the injustice of the past, to make her confront the darkness that had been buried for over a century. Emma stood motionless in the basement, her hands trembling as the echoes of Rose's haunting presence faded into the shadows. The air had warmed slightly, but the coldness that had settled deep within her heart remained. She had learned the truth, the full, tragic story behind the orphanage fire. But it wasn't just the fire that haunted her now. It was the realization that Rose, the girl with the unsettling smile, had never truly found peace. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood in the dim light of the basement. The photograph still lay on the desk, the image of the children frozen in time, their lives forever altered by a tragedy none of them had deserved. But Emma now understood that it wasn't just the fire that had trapped Rose in the past. It was the injustice, the cruelty, and the absence of acknowledgement. Rose had never been given the chance to grieve, to heal, to be understood. The ghostly apparition of Rose had shown Emma something far deeper than just a tragic event. She had shown her the scars that the past had left behind, the echoes of a time when people's actions had shaped a child's fate. And now, in the quiet of the basement, Emma knew what she had to do. She picked up the photograph again, this time with a sense of reverence. Rose's face, though still haunting, no longer seemed to mock her or fill her with dread. It was a face that had been tormented, a face that had seen too much for a child so young. Emma gently placed the photograph back in its envelope, but this time, there was no fear, only a deep sense of responsibility. Emma made her way upstairs and to her desk, where she began to type up her findings. The past had to be acknowledged, not just for Rose, but for all the children who had suffered in silence. She started with the details of the fire, the names of the victims, and the dark history of the Thornton Home for children. She recounted Rose's tragic life, the cruelty she had faced, and the mysterious events surrounding her death. And most importantly, Emma wrote about the spirit that had come to her, seeking justice and recognition. When she was finished, Emma stood up, feeling the weight of her decision. She couldn't change the past, but she could ensure that Rose's story was finally told, that her suffering was recognized, and that the truth would no longer be hidden. The next day, Emma went to the town cemetery. It was a quiet, serene place, the perfect location to pay tribute to the lives that had been lost. She stood before the gravestones of the children who had perished in the fire, her heart heavy with sorrow. But as she looked around, she realized that there was no marker for Rose, no headstone, no sign that the girl who had suffered so much had ever existed. Emma stood there for a long time, her thoughts lost in the memories of the girl who had never had the chance to be free. She pulled out a small notebook from her bag and wrote down a few words, a tribute to Rose, to the other children, and to the forgotten souls of the orphanage. She promised to make sure Rose's name would never be lost again. Later that afternoon, Emma returned to the Historical Society, where she began working on creating a memorial for the victims of the fire. The photograph of the children, which had once been a symbol of terror, was now a symbol of remembrance. She placed it on a pedestal in the archives, next to a plaque that bore the names of the children and staff who had died. But there was one name that stood out: Rose Collins. Emma didn't know if the spirit of Rose would ever find true peace. But she knew one thing. By acknowledging her pain and her story, she had given Rose something she had been denied in life: recognition. Rose's spirit had been bound to the past for far too long, but now it was free. And as Emma sat in the quiet archives, she felt a strange sense of relief. The photograph, the memory of Rose, would never fade again. It was no longer a haunting image of terror, but a symbol of justice and remembrance. As the sunlight faded outside, Emma glanced at the photograph one last time. Rose's smile had softened. It wasn't the malicious grin that had once filled Emma with fear. It was a smile that spoke of relief, of peace, and of a story that had finally been told. As Emma left the Historical Society that evening, the weight of the past still lingered heavily on her heart. The story of Rose Collins and the Thornton Home for children had left an indelible mark on her, one that would stay with her long after the investigation had ended. She had uncovered the truth, not just about the fire, but about the silent suffering that had been hidden for over a century. The town of Westbrook would never be the same. Emma knew that the memorial she had created for the children and staff who had perished in the fire would ensure that their stories were not forgotten. The photograph of the children, once a symbol of dread, now stood as a testament to their lives and the tragedy that had claimed them. But it was Rose's name, etched alongside the others, that carried the deepest significance. Rose had been the one who had been left behind, the one whose pain had gone unacknowledged. But now her story had been told, and her spirit had found peace. The quiet of the town had returned, but Emma knew it would never be the same for her. Every time she walked past the historical society, every time she saw the photograph of the children, she would remember Rose. The haunting smile that had once filled her with terror now held no power over her. It was a smile that spoke of understanding, of finally being seen. As Emma drove home, she looked out over the quiet streets of Westbrook. The night was calm, the air crisp and clear. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. The darkness that had hung over her, the constant feeling of being watched, had finally lifted. Rose's spirit had been set free, and Emma had done what she could to ensure that the past was no longer a haunting memory. But as she pulled into her driveway, a fleeting thought crossed her mind, a whisper of doubt that she couldn't quite shake. Had Rose truly found peace? The photograph, with its haunting smile, would never leave Emma's mind. The past had been laid to rest, but some spirits, some stories, never truly fade. They remain with you, lingering, waiting to be remembered.